heavy rainfall. Okay, I'll just click that off. So yes, it all goes around rotational grazing. But the thing is, even with rotational grazing in place, if you don't have that area to put the horses in when it's too wet, too dry, when there's not enough feed, or on those occasions as well, which can happen quite a bit in Victoria, where there's too much feed, without that area to put them in, the system will fall down, the system of rotational grazing, because what will happen is you will have to move horses back into a paddock, for instance, that you rested, but because of drought, the grass hasn't really grown at all or enough or whatever. And so you're just then on a downward spiral. So this area of hard standing is absolutely imperative when it comes to managing your land. Whatever it costs, it will pay you back tenfold or whatever over the years, because it's so necessary. And once people get their head around that and start to think that way, then everything changes, because it's so important.
Can I just interrupt you there? Sorry, Jane, and just mention to those listening that it is okay to interrupt, and if you don't want to interrupt with a question orally, then you can also just pop it in the meeting chat and we can get to it at the end. So yeah, sorry, I should have mentioned that earlier. Yeah.
So that area of hard standing is, so important. And in many cases, it just requires a change of management. In many cases, people actually already have what they need. They just need to manage it differently, because a lot of the way we keep horses is based on traditional management systems, which didn't take any of this into account. It was all about keeping horses nearby for, originally for people in the army to be able to access those horses quickly and easily and so on. It's all based around military systems originally. So a lot of the way that horses are traditionally kept just doesn't make sense in the modern world, and it's not good for horses, it's not good for the land, and it's not good for people either. So we turn everything on its head, basically. So this area, so in this talk, I'm going to go through, I've just already started going through why we need it, but the expense of doing it, other uses that you can have for that surface. Can you use what you already have? Have you already got something that can be used? Ideas for what you can use for the surface, the fencing, briefly, the positioning of it, the size of the area compared to the size of the horses, as shelters and so on. So I'll go through these one by one. So I've already said that, it's imperative. The reason it must be surface is if it's not surface, then that area, when you put your horses into it, because, for instance, it's too dry on the land or it's too wet on the land, if that area is not surface, then that will very quickly become worse than the area that you've removed them from. So the surface is really, really important. As I said, it is expensive, but it will pay you back, because what will happen then is you will then grow more grass, but you'll also grow healthier, safer grass, and it will save you a lot of money over time. I mean, there's a really good example of somebody in Queensland, for instance, who wrote to us many years ago after going to one of our talks many years ago. And she had a livery yard up there, and she went from spending 2,000, it was either a week or a month on feed, this is years ago, to nothing in certain times of the year. And obviously certain times she had to still top the feed up, but her feed bill just reduced dramatically just by changing to rotational grazing and having somewhere to take the horses off the pressure of the land. So when I say, can you use what you have already, in Australia in particular, people are more likely to have, for instance, a training yard or an arena, a sand area. They might already have something like that, which it might not have occurred to them that they can actually use that as a holding area. If you already have somewhere like that, think about how much it costs to build that area and how much you actually use it now. And if that is repurposed for holding your horses off the land, then you're actually getting better value for money from it. And sometimes you don't even need to use the whole area. So, for instance, talking now about the size of it, a lot of people think they need their holding area to be really large, when in fact when horses are in eating hay and just loafing, as we call it, they don't actually move that much at all. So providing with them a huge surfaced area doesn't mean that they'll actually get any exercise. And I'm going to digress now to what makes horses move is grazing. So when horses are grazing, they're moving constantly as they graze. They might stand still for for a minute, but they're always moving on, looking for more grass. And the more biodiverse your grass is, the more they move. So if you have a paddock sown down as 100% ryegrass, which we'd never recommend, the horses don't have to move that much. They still obviously have to move once they've eaten the bit they've eaten, but they're not searching for something different because there's nothing different in there. Whereas when you have a paddock full of biodiverse, lots of different grasses, they're moving constantly. So this is what we should be aiming for. Is this area then means that your grazing can become more biodiverse because you're managing it properly. So one leads to the other, so that when they're out, they're having quality grazing time, they're moving more, they're getting better, healthier grasses. And when they're in, they're taking the pressure off the land, but they're eating hay and they don't tend to move that much. There's not a lot you can do about that. On the other hand, if you do have a large area, so just say you're using an arena, you can put the water at one end, the hay at the other. They'll have to move between one and the other. If they're young horses, they will tend to play more and get more exercise that way. If they're older horses, they might not so much. So it does vary a lot depending on the type of horses that you have and so on. So every situation is different, but what we always say is, first of all, look at what you already have and can that be repurposed? Can it be that you can just add some extra area around the outside of an arena, for instance? That sort of thing, because what you don't want to be doing is spending a fortune on something if you've already got, what you need anyway. So this area, once you've created it, so just whether you've got to create it from scratch, whether you've already got it, it has many other uses. So it's good for, if say you've got a sick horse, it's good for routine treatments of horses. So it's good for handling horses when you need to do things with them. It's great for grooming and tacking up and so on. It's good for managing their feed intake. So we don't overly, like to think about massively restricting horses or whatever, because that can actually lead to other issues as well. We like to think in terms of as much as possible giving horses ad lib hay, but hay that's low in energy. But obviously, in a drought situation, it gets harder to actually manage the kind of hay you can buy. But where possible, you need to be giving your horses ad lib hay, but hay that's low in energy. And so this yard is perfect for that. But it's also good for increased feed management. So if you've got a horse who needs extra feed, then it's somewhere to actually feed those horses and keep them away from the others, for instance. It's good for isolation. If you do get a new horse, it's somewhere that you can keep a new horse before you introduce them into the main herd. It's good for worm management. So if you've wormed your horses and it's a wormer that is damaging to dung beetles, and dung beetles are currently active, then it could be somewhere you can hold the horses and pick up their manure and dispose of it separately. And obviously it's good as a training area. So for those reasons, it's really good if your holding area is within view of your grazing areas, if possible. It doesn't always work out that way, but it means that then if a horse is being held in there, they can still see the other horses and are not going to panic. So preferably, you don't want it in an area where when a horse is in there, it can't see another horse. On the other hand, if that's all you can do, that's fine. It just means that when you've got a horse in there, you'd always need to have a second horse in there, keeping them company or whatever. So these are some of the things you need to think about. As I say, every situation is different. You just need to keep these things in mind. So when it comes to the surface, the considerations are, if you're going to use it also as a riding area, and I did that in both Victoria and Queensland, I had a really good surfaced area of sand, which was great for training and riding, but was also good as a holding area. So sand makes a lot of sense when you're using it for that. So you would get a contractor in usually to dig out the topsoil, get gravel down, different grades or whatever, and then finish off with sand. So sand works really, really well as a surface area. Some people don't like it because they're worried about sand colic. We never ever had an issue with sand colic, because what you need to do is feed any hard feed off the sand area, or have mats down or whatever. As long as horses aren't picking up hard feed that they've dropped on the ground from sand, they won't tend to pick up sand. And if you're feeding round bales of hay, for instance, and you're feeding them on rubber mats, then again, they're not going to be picking up sand. The horses get sand colic when they're either grazing on grass that's too short in a sandy area. So they're in that case, they're actually picking up sand as they're grazing constantly, because they tend to pull the grass out with the roots and all when it gets that short, and they'll actually ingest a lot of sand in that situation. Or when they're being fed hard feed, and then just say they're being fed it in a feeder on a gate or whatever, and it drops on the floor, and then as they pick all the little bits up, they're picking a lot of sand up. So unless that's happening, sand is not, we never ever had a problem with sand or sand colic or whatever. It's overgrazing that's more likely to lead to sand colic. And sand is, a relatively cheap surface. Horses love it for lying on and rolling on. It's cool. It drains well. It's got so many advantages. So sand is definitely usually the first choice. There's something that I wanted to tell you about that I've only just learned about, and I have absolutely no experience of this, but we're just starting to read about it here in the UK. And I'm sure that it would be something you could look at in Australia. Over here in the UK, sheep skins, so the wool that's sheared off sheep, is actually now incredibly worth absolutely nothing. So when farmers shear sheep over here, it actually becomes a waste product. It's got no value whatsoever. And what regenerative grazers are doing now is starting to use it in gateways. So first of all, they just started doing things like just putting it down in gateways to absorb some of the water and so on. It was working really well. And now there's a concept called sheepskin lasagna. And again, I don't know that, I've only just started looking into this myself, but you will be able to find out a bit more about this online, especially on the regenerative grazing website, groups and so on. It's where they layer sheepskin with first a membrane, then sheepskin, then sticks, and then another layer of the same. So that's why they call it a lasagna, because it was these different layers. And it's working incredibly well. And here in the UK, it hasn't stopped raining since the beginning of July last year. It's been an incredibly wet time. And so we've had the odd good day, but apart from that, it's rained. And people are having enormous success doing this, even for horses and horse properties and so on. And it's very cheap. So that's something to look at. It might be something you might just start off trying in a gateway, if it's a muddy gateway or whatever. But from the success that people are having in it, they're actually starting to use it on bigger areas in yards and so on as well. So that's definitely something to have a look at, because I'm sure that that's something that could be used, especially in Victoria, if you want to take that further. So I've already mentioned about the positioning. So it needs to be where horses can see other horses if possible. Fencing, when it comes to an enclosed area, we always say that any money you spend on horse property, we always try to minimise how much you spend on fencing. And the way you can do that is by having good biodiverse grazing. Means that you don't have to spend a lot on fencing. The reason horses put a lot of pressure on fences is when the land is in poor condition and the grazing on the other side of the fence is better, because grass is always greener on the other side of the fence. So if you look after your land well, then you can manage with less expensive fencing. Plus, as I've always believed, that just because the fence is expensive doesn't mean it's safe anyway. Horses will wreck themselves on almost any kind of fence in the certain situations. So it's all about creating grazing land that keeps the horses content, keeps their heads down grazing and so on, and about creating the right shapes in paddocks so that horses move around corners when they're galloping, all that type of thing. But I'm not talking about that particularly now. We're talking about in the holding area. So the reason I'm saying that is when it comes to your holding area, the fence does need to be pretty solid and pretty good, because horses are going to be closer to it and there isn't going to be any grazing in that area. So if you, if you spend money on fencing, it needs to be on the holding area more than the actual paddocks, if you see what I mean. Obviously, your perimeter fence has to be really good on the property, but your internal fences between paddocks can be just electric. Whereas with your holding area, I wouldn't recommend an electric fence. It's too small an area, and you've got horses in too close proximity to each other and the fence to be in electric. That said, people often do have, say, run-out yards on stables that have electric around them, which to me is a welfare issue, because horses are then in a very small area and aware of electric on either side of them. It's just too much. It's far too tight. But anyway, that's going off a bit. So, but initially, as we always say, with everything, when you first start out, electric can be good for just testing out the shape of something and so on, or for just getting them off the land in an emergency. So don't be afraid to use electric, but look at, in the future, having some kind of solid fencing around your holding area. So something like a pipe fence, maybe post and rail, but pipe fencing works really well in that sort of situation. Something that horses can bang into without injuring themselves too much, or without injuring themselves at all, hopefully. So think about that in your holding areas. Excuse me. So coming back to the size of the area, very roughly speaking, we talk about 7 square meters for per horse, but that is a really rough figure, because if you have older horses that are very settled, you'll probably get away with less. If you have young, boisterous warm bloods, for instance, then you might need a bit more. If you've just got a herd of Shetland ponies, then obviously you'll need less than if you've got a herd of big horses, and so on. So it varies a lot. Basically, that area that I just said is about the size of 2 stables together, double-sized stable, roughly per horse. But as I said, it varies a lot. We often see people build an area that's too big, which is absolutely fine if you're also riding on it. But if you put a lot of money into a huge area, that reduces the amount of grazing you have, and you'll probably find that they don't really use that larger area that much anyway. So, it doesn't need to be too big usually. Try and err on the smaller side than the larger side is what I'm trying to say. Try and have rounded corners. Try not to have any sharp areas that they can get, any acute corners that they can get trapped in, and that kind of thing. Sorry, that's me. I'm going to ask a question. Vegetation. You can grow vegetation around the outside of it. It could be a really good place to actually grow fodder trees, which I talked about in my last talk. So have a listen to that if you want to learn more about that. A bit of browse around the outside is really good. On the other hand, you don't want too much vegetation, making it so that if the area gets wet, although hopefully it will drain well anyway if you've got a good surface down, but you don't want it to be so that the area is always in shade, for instance. You want a bit of a mix so that horses can get in and out of the shade. But our preference is to actually have man-made shelter in a holding area usually. It's very hard to actually get natural shelter to work in a holding area as well as it can work out, say, on the land itself, because depending on the vegetation types, it might be that it still lets a lot of rain through. It takes a long time to actually get to maturity, to the point where it actually does the job it needs to, and so on. So if you've already got good vegetation, that's fine. But if you're just starting out, then it's going to be years before that vegetation is actually going to be able to do what you need it to do. So a simple roof works really, really well in this situation. Something that horses can get under in heavy rainfall, because don't forget that in the wild, horses can always move themselves around and try and find something better, so something that suits their needs. Whereas in captivity, we take that away from them. We take their choices away from them, and our system gives them some of that back by allowing horses to go out on when the gates open, to get themselves out onto grazing when they need to, and then back onto the holding area where the water is. That's what it entails, but it's still reduced compared to what they would have out in the wild, where they can make their own decisions about what kind of shelter to stand under and so on. The shelter doesn't have to be expensive necessarily. Like, as I say, just a carport roof that they can get under, something that they can. Sorry,
Joanna, Are you trying to ask a question?
No.
Oh, okay. Maybe just put yourself on mute because it sort of is, it's just coming through on the audio.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. Thank you. Where was I? Yeah, so a simple roof can work really well. If you already had stables, for instance, a lot of people, what they might do is take the partitions out so that it becomes a run-in and run-out shed. That can work really well. Something that people really like is this idea of having a shelter which from above looks something like this, where the horses, so it might have a roof on it, but it might be Y-shaped or X-shaped, and the horses can actually stand at various points around the shelter. That can work really well and is not necessarily expensive to build. And that way then also it works really well for the different times of day. So it works really well. You know, they can move themselves around to maximize heat or cold or whatever. So that's a really simple, really good kind of shelter. You sometimes see that on some of the larger stud farms, that kind of that idea of like a bus stop shelter, they sometimes call it, but not necessarily the X or Y shape. So that's something to think about.
Just a question on that, Jane. So you're suggesting that shelter goes inside the holding yard?
Absolutely. Sorry, yeah, I should have made that clear. So in our system, you only have one holding yard, if possible, and one shelter. So rather than having shelters in every paddock, which means that when you switch, if you're not already, if you switch to rotational grazing, that means a paddock is only in use for, say, 1/3 of the year, because you rotate. You know, it might be that you do more rotations than that, but in total, that area, the grazing area, will only be in use for part of each year. And that actually leads to far more grass in the long run. But anyway, that means if you have a shelter in every paddock, that's the expense of putting a shelter in every paddock. Whereas with the equicentral system, you have one holding area and one shelter, which is in use every single day of the year. And the horses can always get themselves from wherever they're grazing, wherever there is currently being used as a grazing area, back to the holding area that has the shelter, because that's what most closely copies what horses do in the wild. They go out, walk out to grazing areas, and then when they finish the grazing bout, they walk themselves back to wherever their preferred shelter is to have water, to snooze, play for the younger ones, and basically carry out loafing behaviour. And that's what the equicentral system does, is it copies that. And it works really, really well. So you find then that the horses will only be out on the grazing areas when they need to graze. And as soon as they've finished, they will voluntarily bring themselves back and they'll carry out their loafing behaviour. So that's all that hoof pressure, which would be creating mud on your land or dust if it's dry, instead is brought back to the surfaced area. And it makes an absolutely massive difference, because suddenly then the land is under a lot less pressure, because nearly every horse property, whether it's here in the UK or in Australia, is under too much pressure, and it's a low level continuous pressure that it's under. So in the wild, land is under a high amount of pressure for a really short space of time, because a large herds of animals will move across it, put lots of pressure on it, but then move on and leave it. And on a horse property, the land tends to be under constant pressure. And that's what we're trying to remove, because that's what grasses have not evolved to be able to cope with, that constant day in, hour out pressure. That's what they can't cope with. And that's why they give up and die. And then you end up usually with just a load of weeds or whatever in an extreme situation.
Jane, sorry, just to interrupt you there. I just wanted to ask, is this model then predicated on shared paddocks, i.e. horses being in the herd, as opposed to private paddocks?
It is. If it's your own land and your own horses, then as much as possible you need to get horses into herds as much as possible. You might have some horses that you just can't, and it does make everything much harder. In a situation where horses are on livery and they tend to be in single paddocks, again, it makes managing the land much harder. But it's possible to still improve things by subdividing that area they might have and still having a shelter that they can bring themselves back to. You'll still get some improvement, but the biggest improvement happens when you keep your horses as in a herd, and then rotationally graze your land. That's when you'll see the biggest improvement, and it really is phenomenal, the amount of improvement that you'll see in that situation. In a drought situation, initially you won't see any much change at all if you're already in drought when you start to change things over. But you will be doing damage control, and then it means that in future years, it means that if you stop the horses going out on the land in drought before they've shattered all the grasses and so on, it means that when the drought breaks, that land will recover much more quickly than it would have done. It will, recover almost immediately as soon as it gets rain. Whereas if it's been battered right through the drought, then it will take a lot more to recover. It takes a lot longer to recover.
How many hours a day are you suggesting they should be on the hard stand?
This again, it varies enormously. So if in a good year, then if the horses can manage with that amount of grazing, then they might have access to the grazing areas 24/7. And in that case, they will voluntarily tend to graze for around a total of 12 hours a day. And voluntarily they will stand on that hard standing for about 12 hours a day. But the gates can actually be open in that case if everything's okay and they're bringing themselves in and out. In a drought situation or a very wet situation, you might decide to only let them have, say, one grazing bout a day, which will usually last around 3 hours, and the rest of the time they might be on the hard standing. It all depends, because the thing is when they're being allowed to keep going out on the land that's not ready for grazing, it's just on a downward spiral. That's the problem. So you can do that, but it means that there's going to be payback later on because you've overgrazed the land, basically. So with horses, say that can't graze as much because they've got issues with laminitis or whatever. Again, it might be that they only get to graze for one grazing bout a day, and the rest of the time they're on the hard standing. So it sounds like they're locked up a lot, but on the other hand, if you look at horses in paddocks that don't have good grass in them, they will mainly just be standing around anyway. They don't walk around going, oh, no, there's nothing to eat, but I need to keep fit because we've got a competition coming up and we better get walking. They don't do that. They just stand around when there's no grazing to be had. And all that time they're standing around, they're degrading the land. So they're either creating mud or dust, one or the other. So once you start thinking this way and watch them and realise that's what's happening, then your attitude then can become, well, if you're just going to stand around, then you can just stand around on a surface rather than on the land itself. And then again, that's when it starts to all improve. And it means then that even though you might have to hold them initially more than you would like, because you're then letting the land get in front of the horses, whereas before it was always trying to play catch up, now what you're doing is you've created a situation where the land can actually improve. It means that in the future, you will actually be able to turn your horses out a lot more. That's the thing, when the conditions are right. So it's about holding your horses now to actually improve things in the future, get the land in front of the horses, and then and so on. But just say you've got 3 horses and 5 acres, which is a really common occurrence, and you don't really have 5 acres because if you've got the house on there, so you might have 3 acres, 3 or 4 acres tops. You're always going to have times of the year where you don't have enough grazing, always, but there'll be other times where if you manage it well, you might have too much grazing. So this is what this holding area allows you to do, is to manage those booms and slumps, but also make it so that the land is on a continual cycle of improvement rather than a continual downward degrading cycle. That's what it's allowing you to do.
Jane,
Sorry?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
It's Tessa here from Project Hope. I really relate to what you're saying. Thank you for the talk. So in resting a couple of acres paddock for some months, while the soil might be a bit rested and not as compacted, the kangaroo problem is not, I think, allowing grass. I can't manage that, and it just is making the downward spiral even quicker. Any suggestions?
No, that's a really tricky one. That is really difficult. And we had that problem as well in one place. I don't know. I can't help you with that one, sorry, because unless anybody else has got any suggestions, because obviously on a smaller place you can look at fencing, but obviously that's not feasible on, you know, for a lot of people because of the expense of it. And this is going to become a problem. I mean, obviously in drought it happens more because those animals, you know, their own grazing becomes depleted, so they start looking to places they wouldn't normally, and so on. So that is an issue. The only small, what's the word, pluses are that when you've got kangaroos coming on your land, you've got some cross-grazing benefits. So they will be picking up some of the worms that your horses would be damaging to your horses and killing them out in their system, because that's, you know, they're an animal that those worms have not evolved to survive in. And when they're grazing on your land, they're not doing quite as much damage as hard-hoofed animals. But that's small consolation, yeah, I know, when you're trying to grow grass and then the kangaroos come in and eat it all.
Yeah, I'd like the grass to be about 4 inches long.
Yeah.
Thereabouts, and it's just never getting there. And, you know, I could just wait till next winter and it wouldn't get there.
It's difficult, yeah, I know.
Can I make a suggestion to that question? Excuse my voice, sorry, I've got a touch of the flu. We live in an area where there's a huge problem with kangaroo and deer, and the ways that the farmers manage that is through the way they rotationally graze. So if you're aware of the times of year and the particular paddocks that the kangaroos favour, if you can manage your grazing so that you can make sure you're grazing it out with your horses first before you know the deer or whatever animal you're having trouble with comes to that area. In a sense, you're getting the benefit of that grass before the kangaroos can come on. That's just one way that I'm aware that farmers in my area manage the deer problem here with grazing.
I
don't know if that helps. Sorry, I just thought I'd throw that in the mix.
Yeah, I kind of incidentally did that, and it was very brief though, so you know we're back to nothing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
someone's just asking Jane for you to just describe the shelter again.
Yeah, do you mean the Y-shaped one? Is that what you mean?
I'm assuming so, yes.
So either from above, it would look either like that or as a Y shape from above. So, and then with a roof on. We actually have, what I'll do is I'll actually send a picture of it, and you could email it out to participants if you like.
Okay.
The one we came across was actually at a livery in New South Wales, and so many people have asked us for that picture over the years. It was at a big livery centre, and it really is. And actually, they built that after we visited World Horse Welfare here in the UK, and they had something similar. So yeah, anyway, I'll send that picture to you, and you can have a look at it. But it's, you know, it's a very inexpensive way of building a shelter and very effective. So yeah, I think I've covered most of the things. So, have we got any more questions?
Actually, somebody has also just mentioned that there is a property that's been set up using the Equicentral system in the Yarra Valley, and there is a link to it there. If you just go into the meeting chat, there is there's a link within that chat that and perhaps one of those shelters is actually in that property.
Yeah. If you haven't already, we've got a short free course on our website that you can sign up to. There may even be a picture of it in there, to be honest. But also on our website, we've got various videos about things like dung beetles. So today I've only touched a little bit on grazing and so on, but our approach is all about also looking at things like dung beetles on your land, because they will not only manage your manure for you in a way that you could never hope to manage it yourself, because they're the world's experts at it, and what they do with it is absolutely incredible. But at the same time, they're improving your soil. They're making it less compacted if it's compacted. So they're aerating it. They're making it so that when it rains, more of that rain will get into the soil rather than wash off. I mean, the improvements they make are just phenomenal. So we've got a video on that on our website that you can watch. There's a few other videos. Oh, there's one on mulching. Mulching's a really interesting one as well, where you're using hay to actually regenerate areas on your land that might that are bare to start with. So another option as well is when you're feeding hay, and again, this is harder as hay becomes more expensive, but if you're feeding large round bales of grass hay, just say you've got an area on your paddock, and it's usually a gateway or whatever that's been degraded because it's had too much hoof pressure before you learned about keeping them on hard surfaced areas. You could actually feed a round bale in that area and have the horses walking from their holding area to that and back to water and so on. So you can get quite inventive with it really. But the idea of mulching is that they eat a round bale and they knock off the bits that they don't want to eat. They trample it into the ground, and that actually becomes over time new soil. So you can massively regenerate an area using mulching practices. So we did it a lot on very sandy soil when we first moved to Queensland. In southeast Queensland, when we were on a property that was nearly all sand rather. So that's something to learn about as well. But
what? Sorry.
Sorry.
Were you going to continue with something there?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, okay. I was just going to say, with feeding hay on those hard surfaces, your sort of lock-up areas or the gateways. Do you not find, I have certainly found that feeding hay on those hard areas is actually bad for the surface, because it actually encourages that to be basically mulched in, and it the rock then kind of disappears in all the hay and all the stuff.
So when you're mulching, so basically if you're feeding hay on your hard surface, you're better off feeding it under, say, some kind of feeder or in a feeder where there's minimal waste. And drop any waste that comes off it and chucking that out on the paddock or whatever. On the other hand, if you're feeding hay in an area that you want to, like on a bare soil area that you're hoping to regrow grass on, then you actually let them trample a certain amount of that hay, the stuff that they won't anyway, and that then becomes soil. So yeah, it's complete opposite depending on whether if you're on a hard surfaced area, you want minimal wastage.
So how do you manage that? How do you manage feeding hay on a hard stand where you don't want the hay on the ground?
So then you'd feed it in feeders. So like, you can either get nets that cover a whole round bale. If you're feeding a round bale, you can get various types of feeder. You can get those plastic covers for a round bale, so that you can actually put a net over it and then a plastic cover over the top of it, so there's hardly any wastage at all. You could feed it on rubber areas within, off the sand, so that you can then clean up whatever's left behind, and again, never throw it away, get it out on the land rather than actually go. So it depends on the surface. And obviously this is one thing that makes people a bit wary about using the arena, for instance. So in that case, again, that's what you would need to be doing, is either create a feeding area down one end, which is the only place that you feed hay, but again, you wouldn't be feeding it loose so much. You'd be feeding it in some kind of containers and nets and so on to minimise wastage. Otherwise, you're going to be constantly picking up that wastage and having to cart it out onto the land. Whereas if you're doing a gateway, that's what you want to happen. You want it to actually break down, feed them in the gateway, then shut that area off and let it regenerate. So it all depends on, what the surface is, whether you want to mulch it or not. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah.
There's also somebody else, Nicole, has asked, she's saying these are the type of shelters that are being talked about.
Right. So,
but maybe she's got a photo coming anyway.
So you're on mute, sorry.
Oh,
right. So Jane, I was just wondering if you could touch on how to manage changes of levels on a property, even if there's many properties have an incline over the whole property, and just trying to manage that from a hard stand area into the pastures, or from a stable into a hard stand area.
So you mean if the land is undulating, you mean?
Or yes, even just with a slight level. How you do a retaining area, or how you manage those changes in levels. Yeah,
so whenever possible, you want your holding area to be on the highest, driest part of the land. Is that what you mean? So the rest of the land might be lower down, for instance. So you don't want your holding area to be down the bottom of a hill, for instance, and then the rain comes and the horses are trapped, in an area, and then they could be trapped in water. Plus, it's not going to drain as well lower down. So always have your holding areas, and also the holding area, if possible, could do with being near the house, because the horses will always gravitate towards that area voluntarily, because that's where the feed comes from. That's where the people who bring the feed come from, and so on. So you want that on the high and dry area. The other areas of the land, then, so just say you've got, a slope going down to a wet area. I talked about this a little bit in the other talk. Always separate wet areas on the land from dry areas on the land, and that can just be a simple electric fence. But so that when they are grazing those areas, they're grazing them at the optimum time. So the wet areas, they would be grazing mainly during a drought type situation, when that would hold its feed for the longest during a drought. And the drier areas of the land can be grazed in the wetter times of year, because they can cope with grazing in those wet conditions. But again, having this area of outstanding allows you to completely manage that grazing, so that it's never getting overgrazed, which is when you don't have an area to hold them. There'll always be a time when areas are being overgrazed. And when I say overgrazed, it gets to the point where they're not even grazing anymore. They're just standing on the land, creating an enormous amount of damage because they're hard-hooved animals. So they just that standing around behaviour on soil that's too dry or too wet will degrade it. And it's about removing that hoof pressure so that doesn't happen. So is that what you wanted, Kathy?
Would you often have sort of a retaining element, like the sides of an arena between the sand area and stepping out into the pasture or laneway?
So do you mean like a surface,
or like a plinth or an edging to standing, sand and soft hard surface?
Yeah, we once did one where we put sleepers around the outside, but in the end, when we redid it, when we moved to another property, we didn't actually bother, because if you actually have grass around the edge and if it's done properly, you don't actually necessarily need that retaining area. Again, what you plant around the outside will make a big difference. So and the way it's graded, as long as it doesn't drop immediately away from your surface, in which case then your surface will tend to wash away at the edges. If you can actually have it so that you've got your surface and then it still carries on at that level for a couple of feet, so that you can actually get, or a bit more even, so you can get some vegetation happening around there on the outside of the fence, but on the just on the outside, it will mean that surface won't wash away. Whereas if you have your arena and then it immediately goes like that at the fence, it will drop off. But it's somebody who's constructing that surface, if they're experienced, they should know that. They should know to advise that you actually end up with an edge to it.
Sorry.
Hi. Oh, sorry.
Sorry. I didn't realise I wasn't on mute. My son came in to say goodnight. I was like, oh, sorry, I'm on mute.
So is that a question?
No, somebody was just they were supposed to be on mute. Sorry.
Right, no problem. So did that answer your question, Kathy?
Yes, I think I just have one more quick question, and probably in the UK with all the rain over the last year, you'll be well qualified to answer that. Do most people find that they have more success taking some of the topsoil away and establishing some stone base?
Absolutely, yeah. If you leave topsoil, then in a holding area, then that will become mud. So when you're constructing a holding area, one of the most important things is the topsoil is taken off and then replaced with something that drains. So, small stones, gravel, different types of gravel and so on, and then sand or whatever. Bark in some cases, but it needs to be hardwood, and you need to understand that in time that will break down and will have to be removed and replaced. But on the other hand, if it's done deep enough and done well enough, it might last for several years, and it can be incredibly cheap if you get the right hardwood type of bark. So that can work well. if it's just for holding and not for riding on, it doesn't tend to work as well as a riding surface. So again, sand is usually the best thing, but you wouldn't just put sand straight onto topsoil, because then that will mix with your topsoil and just become mud again. Topsoil will become mud, you know, if you don't remove it. So you're better off taking that off, putting it into an area that it's needed on the property, and creating a proper surface. But again, if you're getting a professional in to do this, then they would never leave the topsoil on there. They would always remove that first. If you're doing it yourself, then you just need to get a bit of advice about how to do it, how to get the layers right, so that you get the best kind of surface. But we've done years and years ago, when we still had the energy, we did our own surfaces by hiring machinery, and actually had huge success with initially when we were much younger, we built a big 60 by 40 arena and did it all ourselves with hired machinery, and it worked absolutely great. And then later on we did a smaller area in Queensland, so it's possible to do it. And we got the advice of a really good arena maker in the area, somebody in Australia who's particularly good at making arenas, and his advice works really well. And we do talk about, I'm not trying to flog the course because that's not why I'm here, but we do talk about that in the books that we have, and in the course that we do. But you can't just get the book. The book number 3 goes into building, holding yards, stables, arenas, a whole lot, goes into all that in quite a lot of detail. You can get that as a PDF off the website very inexpensively. So if you're thinking of building something, maybe have a look at that, because there's a lot of advice on there.
Jane, can I just ask a question? It seems like in the UK, some people are using like mud control mats.
Yes, actually, point. Yes.
What do you think of them? Because they've just come to Australia. They're quite expensive in Australia, and I just don't know whether they're worth the investment or not.
Yeah, good question. I'm glad you said that, because I meant to talk about them and I forgot. People are having huge success with them here, because mud is a huge issue here, especially down in the south of England where we don't live, where it's very, very clay-based. So yes, they are very expensive. People like them here, 1, because they're really good in the mud, 2, because a lot of people over here don't own their own land, so they might be renting the land. It means that when they leave, they can take them with them. So that's a big plus of mud mats, is that you can actually take them, you can remove them. Not as much of an issue in Australia because people are a bit more likely to own their own land. But I've never, when we still had land, they weren't available, so we've never actually tried them out ourselves. But we're in a lot of groups where people use them. A lot of people in our group use them, and on the whole, people really, really like them. So
what are they made out of?
They're made out of reclaimed rubber, so they're a little bit like those things you see in car parks. In the old, sometimes you used to see, like in a car park, you'd either see them made out of rubber or concrete, where they've got holes between them. They're like a 1 meter square mat, usually, and they all interlock. But they're made out of extremely hard-wearing rubber. They don't wear out. So they say that you can just put them on the soil. Now, I think you would need to do that, from what I've heard, you need to do that in the dry time. You wouldn't just go put them out in a really wet time, otherwise they will sink into the mud. But what they're doing is they're stopping that interaction of hooves to soil, which is what creates the mud. So because you're putting them straight on the top of soil, which is what people do here, because they're not allowed. So for instance, if you're renting land over here, you're not allowed to take the topsoil off to create a hard standing area. Also, there's a lot of restrictions with councils about doing that. So people are actually having success putting them in the summer when it might be dry, straight onto the soil, and then come winter, because the hooves never make contact with the soil, that mud doesn't happen then. So that, they can work really, really well in that situation. But yeah, the biggest downside is the expense. But on the other hand, another way of looking at it is it's a long-term investment, because as far as I know, they're sort of pretty much impossible to wear out. So you'd need to look at the pros and cons, the costs compared to getting somebody in to do a surface for you and all that kind of thing. You need to look at that.
And do you know where you'd get information on those?
Just Google mud mats and so on. Like I said, they are available in Australia now, but they've been available here in the UK for a few years now, and even longer in America. So there's lots of information on them in those two, in America and the UK.
Georgie's just actually put a link on the the chat in this group chat. So yeah, thank you, Georgie.
Yeah.
There's that
Yeah.
will be great to look at.
Definitely worth looking at. Yeah, definitely. So and it depends, you know, on what you have available in your area. I mean, if you have sandy soil to start with, then you're already, you know, winning in that respect, not in terms necessarily of growing grass, although it's not that bad either. But if your sand is, you know, if your soil is sandy, you might not need to go to that expense. Whereas if you've got clay type soil, they can be a real lifesaver in that situation. And the good thing is you can put them down, and if it doesn't quite work, you can take them up again and, you know, and redo them. All right, somebody said that they bought them at Bunnings at a reasonable price, and it's been successful for many, so that's worth looking into. Yeah, so they would presumably have been sold for something else, but they've actually turned out to be good enough for horses. Yeah, definitely worth a look.
Marianne, did you have a question? Are you on mute?
No. Hi, Jane. It's Marianne here. Jane, I've got a question for you in relation to whether or not couch grass growing on your surfaced area. Do you see that as a problem, or any other grass growing on it? Because we've had ours down for a few years now, and we've only once had to resurface the top layer of the quarter minus layer on the top. And in the meantime, we've had, you know, weeds kind of growing in through the top layer. Do you see that as a problem?
Not if your horses are nibbling on it and it's not doing them any harm. You know, if you're not getting any adverse effects from it, then not at all. You know, it's fine. So, you know, some people would poison it, whatever, just to get rid of it. But if it's not actually causing a problem, then, you know, it can actually have some advantages. I mean, if you've got a membrane down, it could be damaging the membrane. But if you haven't got a membrane, I mean, I would avoid trying to let too much manure get on that area and create even more vegetation. That's one problem that can happen when you're not picking up manure, is that then you start to get more and more grass growing. So it can then, over time, it is actually turning back into a grassed area. So you've got to decide really how, you know, whether that's happening and whether it might be getting out of hand a bit. But on the other hand, providing a little bit of a nibble for them while they're in there and it's not getting any worse, then I wouldn't worry about it.
Yeah, I'm worried that a little bit of grass then can attract a whole lot of other grass, because I just think it provides a mat with, you know, soil, and that can come off, you know, the horse's feet or whatever, and then that can become, it can just kind of grow from there. I guess the grass just will.
Yeah, you have to decide. Yeah, you have to decide whether it's worth, you know, trying to get rid of that. Yeah. And again, that can happen when your area is too large, because it's not getting enough roof pressure on it to actually. Normally, in an area that's the right size, it'll be getting the right amount of roof pressure to keep on top of that. Whereas with a larger area, you might find that some bits they never go in, and so it turns back to grass. So you might want to think about, in that case, actually fencing that bit off and letting it become grass again, becoming a grazing area again. It might even be that, you know, worth doing that, for instance.
Yeah, the reason why the grass is being, you know, is able to get hold there is because we have two equicentral areas, one on both sides of the property, and that feeds a number of different paddocks. And when the horses are on one side of the property, they're not using the other yards on the other side, and so it's not getting trampled on as much. I see the grass a bit of a problem, because when we want to top up the quarter minus, the finer gravel on the top, I don't really want to be putting it over the top of grass. So
some people have success using pool salt on grass in those situations. It might be worth finding out a bit about that. You might be able to scatter pool salt on it. It might actually knock the grass back. Have a look at that. I haven't done it myself, but people, you know, some people have success with that.
Okay, thanks, Jane.
Any more questions?
Yeah, if there aren't any more, last of the last, then we might wind up. Thank you, Jane, so much for your expertise and your time today.
Sally,
I'm sure everyone's
So just interrupt. There was just one question from Chantal. I think it might have come. Does anyone have recommendations for the type of gravel that is best for a base? Just one last question.
That does depend on the area you live in and what's available and so on. So every area is completely different. It's down to what you can get in your local area, really. So it's worth asking locally what people use for that kind of thing, because quarries, quarry different kinds of gravel in different areas. So that would be my advice, is find out what's available locally.
Great.
So what size would you, regardless of the type of material, what size would you recommend?
Well, initially, I mean, if it's a really, really boggy area, maybe it's actual rocks, but usually about an inch, half-inch size initially, and something a bit finer, and then sand. That usually that's just a rough guide. That sort of makes a good enough surface. But it's about getting that topsoil off first, and and getting it graded properly, getting the fall right, getting it at the right height so that it's not in a low spot, so that all the water's going to still end up in that type of thing. The good advice we had initially was, don't put that very top layer down until for a month or two if you can, and just watch it and see how the water behaves on it, whether it pools anywhere, whether it's running off properly, whether it needs a little bit more of a fall on it. Get that layer, the second to top layer, just right, and then put your final sand layer on, and that worked brilliantly for us to do that.
That's a good idea.
With a new surface, you get little depressions might come about in the first month or so as it settles. So let it settle, and then put the very top surface on. But obviously in that period you've got to be careful, because you're going to have something that's more rougher than it will end up when you get the sand onto it. But it does work well to do that. But as I said, there's quite a bit of information on in our third book, which is all about creating surfaces and so on. You can get that as a PDF. It's literally a few dollars. That's all. If you're thinking of building something, it might be worth looking at that. Okay.
Thanks from Chantal.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for attending, everybody.
And don't forget that this is available as a recording. If anyone is wanting to refer others or watch it or listen to it again, it'll be available on the Mornington Peninsula